occupying till he comes at Southwest Prophecy Ministries.
Today, Dr. David Snitker and Carol Rushton speak with Joshua Matriciana about his DVD, Transhumanism, Recreating Humanity. Josh is founder of Revolution Films and directed the production, which deals with a subject that's growing in popularity during these last days. Here now are Dr. Snitker and Carol Rushton with Josh Matriciana.
It is a real privilege today to have Josh Matriciana with us via phone to discuss his DVD entitled Transhumanism, Recreating Humanity. Josh is a filmmaker with Revolution Films, which is a branch of Jeremiah Films, which has been a pioneer in the production of Christian documentary films since the 1970s. We're joined on the broadcast today by Carol Rushton, our Vice President of Social Media. We are going to be discussing over the next 3 weeks one of the most disturbing developments of the modern age. That is the whole realm of transhumanism. Everywhere you go in the popular culture, whether it be films or television or books, we are being bombarded with propaganda promoting genetic enhancement, gene doping, super soldiers, robotic humans, hybridizing humans and animals, artificial intelligence, cybernetic intelligence, merging human brains with computers, achieving singularity or transcendence. These are just some of the concepts being explored in modern science and promoted via the media. On these broadcasts, we want to explore all of these areas and how it will affect you as listeners. We also want to give a biblical perspective on these issues. And finally, we want to talk about how transhumanism plays a role in Satan's last days agenda. These are going to be some very interesting broadcasts, and we've been looking forward to having Josh on the program. So Josh, thanks for being with us today.
Oh, thank you, Dave.
Well, before we talk about your film, let's talk about you. Share with our listeners about yourself and how you became interested in making documentary films.
Well, I'm actually a second-generation filmmaker. Both my parents, they have ministries that started off when they were filming on film. And as a kid, this was just kind of something that I grew up in, watching how it was done, watching the technology change. I grew up as a child in the editing room, and some of my fond memories are there being with the editors, learning just the ins and outs of it. When it comes to how I became interested in making documentary films, it was just kind of a logical next step for me. I really love being able to find out the truth and then share it with people who are also interested.
Well, of course, we're in a visual age. Not as many people read books as watch films, so it's a very effective medium for communicating truth today, and I applaud you for that. Tell our listeners a bit more about Revolution Films, which apparently you have begun, as well as, I guess you could say, the parent or predecessor organization, Jeremiah Films, and how they can find out more about your ministry.
Well, Jeremiah Films has been around. It was started by my dad, Pat Matriciano, and now we've kind of switched from being a film company much more to being a video company. It has to do with where our website is, jeremiahfilms.com. We're pretty much moving towards having videos that are available online. We're using YouTube and Facebook, social networks, basically to bring together all this information so that instead of having to watch it in a movie theater on a projector, like it used to be 30 years ago, now anyone can just watch these films from their cell phone. So you can find us online, jeremiahfilms.com, or on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/jeremiahfilms.
Well, thank you, Josh. We have the full line of your films in our bookstore, and they are amazing films. They're hard-hitting, they're relevant, they're truth-filled, and I'm glad that technology is such to where they can be made much more accessible to people all over the world 24/7. So that's a great thing. Now, I understand, probably getting ahead of myself, that you're working on a sequel to the transhumanism film. Maybe you could give our listeners a little bit of an advance word on what that will cover.
Absolutely. So what we've decided to do with this film, and when Transhumanism Recreating Humanity first came out, it was a really kind of a test, because we're moving to a different model of actually playing videos. It was just, it's an hour long, and we hit a lot of different topics underneath, this kind of umbrella of transhumanism. But now what we're doing is, because it's had such a positive response from it, we're going to be releasing these segments of this, the sequels online. So with our sequel to Transhumanism Recreating Humanity, it's not really going to be in the same format as it was before. They're probably going to be smaller, between 20 and 30-minute segments instead of the whole hour. And we're going to be releasing these hopefully on a consistent basis over the next several months and year. Online on our YouTube channel. Yes, sir.
That is exciting. And of course, the developments in this field are so rapid that this is really, I think, a very appropriate way of releasing this material as these developments take place.
Yeah, because, unfortunately, we just don't have DVD players anymore. And if you wanted to play a video for somebody on your iPhone, the only way to do it really is through YouTube or things like that. So that's what we're trying to do, is trying to get this information out there to as many people as possible, and this seems to be the logical next step for us.
Great. Give your website one more time.
JeremiahFilms.com. The transhumanist project that we're working on is transhumanism.tv. Right now, if you go on there, you can download this first film, but eventually we're going to be having all of the segments on there for you to watch at your convenience on demand.
Well, that is great. I appreciate your letting our listeners know about this. Well, as I mentioned in the introduction, Carol Rushton is joining us for these interviews, and I believe Carol has some questions for you.
Josh, it is so great to have you on our program today. I know that our listeners are going to be very interested in listening to all the information you have for them. Let's start with the title of your film, Transhumanism Recreating Humanity. Now, that is a very interesting and very provocative title. However, not all of our listeners may have heard the term transhumanism. So can you explain to our listeners a little bit about your title and why you chose this?
Sure. The transhumanist movement, it's really focusing, you can think of it as a humanist movement, but not just humanist, now that we're moving away from this idea of humankind as, well, I guess you would consider organic human beings created in the image of God. And now we're talking about recreating humanity. It's taking this image of God that we are and basically perverting it. If you read in Genesis 6 and Numbers 13, there is this really interesting verse in there that talks about what we call the Nephilim. And if you look at this, it's a tactic from Lucifer, because he's always tried to come through and pervert what God has created. And you see there's this deliberate tactic against humankind, which is repeated, not just against our physical form, and where it talks about the seed of the sons of God coming in and perverting basically the genetics of man, but it's also through our minds. If you take it, what religion is supposed to be, the pure and unadulterated religion that Jesus taught, giving to the orphans and widows and treating our fellow human beings as we want to be treated, you see this kind of insertion there of a very toxic idea. And we call it basically sin. But if you think about it, it's in the insertion of pride into into what we believe. We believe that we're created images of God. Well, once you insert pride into that, this toxic idea of sin, then we believe that we can be God. It's the first real trick that Satan told Eve. You want to be like God? Well, transhumanism is basically taking this idea that we can be God. First of all, because we don't believe in God if you're a humanist. But then secondly, saying, well, at some point, God might exist because we have created it.
Very interesting. And I think a lot of our listeners would have a lot of concerns about this, especially on the lines of the transhumanism. I know I've seen a lot of articles recently about the cloning of humans, robots, robots taking over jobs that humans have always done. So this, I think, is a great concern and should be of great concern to everyone in our audience. Now, Josh, could you tell our listeners some of the experts that you included in your film and something about them?
Sure. We actually had an opportunity to film Chuck Missler. He's the founder of Koinonia House and just an incredible individual. He is just a wealth of information. He's a self-professed technologist. He knows the ins and outs of a lot of these different industries that a lot of people will say are sciences that contribute to this idea of transhumanism. Also, we have Tom Horn, who I would say probably is the leading expert, especially from the Christian or biblical perspective, on what transhumanism actually is and how it conflicts with the teachings of the Bible. Also in there, we interviewed Rachel Haywire, which is a pseudonym she goes by, who is really kind of in the embodiment of transhumanist ideals. She believes to the nth of it, digital drugs, psychedelics, these kind of things that you see on a much more fringe type of society is becoming much more mainstream, especially around the younger generation. So I feel like she brings a really solid perspective from the transhumanist side.
For those who've just joined us, we are speaking with Josh Matriciano regarding his film, Transhumanism, Recreating Humanity. Well, Josh, technology really seems to be driving this movement. Of course, philosophically, that is also supporting it, but the technology seems to be advancing so quickly. Let's begin to talk about some of these specific technologies. Let's start with human genetic modification. That sounds a little bit scary and complicated. What is human genetic modification?
Well, it's a collection of sciences that embody a lot of different things. You can talk about creating cures for diseases. You can talk about removing things in our body, I guess, that we would consider deviations from perfection. But it's one of the older sciences. When you think about it, the first sheep that was cloned, Dolly, basically opened up, and that was 15 years ago now, I think, maybe 20 years ago. That opened up this whole doorway of research into this. Now we're seeing it that, from starting with around this topic of modifying human beings on a genetic level, we're starting to see the results of that in a very kind of scary way. One of the things that Tom Horn talks about in the film is gene line genetic tinkering, where if you decide that you want your child to have blue eyes or a certain trait, you want them to be a good singer or these things, you can start to work on with science now, basically creating these designer babies. Well, the issue is that it might not just be for that one child, but if it's germline, then for every descendant of that person, they're also going to have these genetic modifications, if you would call it. So it is terrifying when you think about the kind of breadth of the implications of what can change.
Are these designer babies and the human genetic modification somehow related to people even making choices about whether their children can be born? In other words, is this a criteria for whether to abort a child or not?
That's a really good point, and there's been a heated debate about this. A lot of people say that genetic modification will eventually be necessary to make sure that human the human bloodline is benefiting generation from generation instead of degrading itself. Well, the other side to the coin, or the other part of the argument, is that we all have the right to life, and if we decide that these what genetic strain then is going to be found that'll be positive or negative looked at by society for 10. Like when you think about the nth of how this genetic modification can go, you just have to look back to the last World War. We have this idea of eugenics where we want to breed out the genetic characteristics that are negative, and we want to add in the ones that are positive. Well, what if we don't necessarily agree with what they agree with on what is better or not so good? Like, are people with blue eyes really better than people with brown eyes? I guess is the question.
Right. Who are the elites that make those kinds of decisions? Of course, the whole science of eugenics is based upon the idea of elites. The wise men, going all the way back to Plato, that make decisions for society, even life and death decisions as to who has a right to bear children. I think of the eugenics movement that, of course, began before Hitler. That's the most well-known aspect. But, he was taught by Margaret Sanger, who was the founder of the American Eugenics Society. And, of course, we had, prior to World War II, the forced sterilization of thousands of people with various handicaps, mental or otherwise. So it seems to me that this whole field of human genetic modification will have a eugenics aspect to it inevitably.
Yeah, I don't think you can really separate the idea of eugenics from it, because the whole point of it is that exactly what you said. There is this sense of an elite. And who is the elite? Well, apparently the ones with the most up-to-date hardware.
Right. Well, some have referred to, the New World Order as a scientific technocracy. And so you have a scientific elite, technocratic elite, who make these decisions as to who can have children and who cannot, what are the desirable qualities in a human being, and what are the undesirable qualities that need to be weeded out so that we can have the well-born, which is what eugenics mean, is well-born individuals solely given the privilege of living. Well, it is a scary thing, and when fallen humanity gets hold of technologies, invariably they use it the wrong way. Carol has some additional questions for you.
Well, before I go on to my question, I want to point out that the Fabian socialists early in the 1900s were famous for having this position that there were some people who shouldn't have children, and they were very vocal about it. And you can probably find some of these things on YouTube or on the internet today. So this is not a new idea, but the fact that technology now has caught up with the Fabians, the Fabian socialists, the Fabian Society, the eugenics movement, the Margaret Sanger, Planned Parenthood, all of these things, technology has caught up with these ideas so they can actually become reality today. And in case our listeners think that this is a far-fetched thing, a pop celebrity actually recently came out and said that she and her husband had specifically genetically engineered their baby to be a girl. They did not want a boy, they wanted a girl, and they specifically had their baby engineered to be a girl. So in case you think that this is fantasy and this is way out in the future, this is science fiction, it is not. These are things that are happening today. Josh, I think one of the scarier things about this transhumanism movement is that the U.S. military is looking at this, and they want to use technology to create what is called the super soldier. And you touch it about in this in your film. And you have the Iron Man films and some of the other science fiction films today that seem to bring this idea out. And can you talk a little bit about that right now in your film?
Absolutely. The American military is basically the on the forefront of innovation. If it wasn't for them, we wouldn't have GPS, we wouldn't have the internet. There's all these innovations that started from the military. So transhumanism, as we understand it now, has been the forefront of a lot of this military funding for years. We are now starting to see that, I guess, the spirituality behind it, the motivation behind it. But I believe that the United States government, DARPA, some of these innovative companies that are being hired by them have innovations that are beyond what we can even consider right now. talking about some just examples of this. Having a super soldier, for example, let's say with a chip implanted so that he can communicate with other soldiers by thought, or having a chip that maybe can change his DNA structure so it fights against chemical warfare at the time on the battlefield. So there are some real, plausible things here that sound like science fiction, but are written up in military journals, in science journals that are there. And if you just do a quick search on the internet, you're going to find the results of some of these really scary technologies.
One question that I have is that I've seen articles recently about militaries, not just our own, but militaries used by governments around the world, actually doing away with human soldiers and using robots instead. Can you address that?
Well, I'm pretty sure that Obama was the first president that authorized the use of drones. So that we have little robots doing what, instead of putting American boots on the ground, we've got robots doing it for us. Well, there's kind of a disassociated there because you're not seeing the whites of the eyes, so they speak, on the battlefield, but more so like a computer game where you can just hit, okay, fire the missiles. And there's this separation from it. Well, using technology in the battlefield when it comes to drones or what have you is technology that's going to continue to be used. It's being used more and more now. Other countries are adopting it more. The question I have is where does it stop? Where do we draw the line by saying, are we going to be completely, is our armed forces going to be completely robots? And then you bring up the question like, well, did you see the movie Terminator?
Yes. Well, I know that there's also been some concerns brought up by ethicists about killer robots, and that you could maybe program robots to have a killer instinct, or that they would, I think there's been some concerns that they would kill indiscriminately. Is this a really valid concern for us today?
It's just something that is so, it's such a hot topic that's been talked about for, decades. My dad used to read comic magazines in the 40s and 50s, and they talked about space aliens coming in and attacking robots. I mean, this is something that's been a fear of ours for generations. But does it mean that it's going to come to fruition? There are some really compelling TV shows out lately that bring this up. One of them has to with Halle Berry, called Extant. They talk about creating robots and the robot's role in preserving human life. These are very interesting topics to muse about. Do I think that my lawnmower is going to come and try to attack me in my sleep in 10 years? Well, it could be a possibility, but I'm not sure that's the most important one.
Do you have any more questions, David?
Yes, along with that, is there an agency? You mentioned in your film a military agency that's working on these exotic applications of transhumanist technologies, and it's DARPA. Could you tell us what those letters mean and the kinds of developments that are going on within DARPA?
Absolutely. Remember, we mentioned just a little bit earlier that DARPA is the Department of Armed Research Projects Agency, and they're on the forefront of basically creating new technology. It's really interesting to think that just last week, Regina Dugan, who used to be the head of DARPA, was hired on by Google, the #1 technology company in the world. Last week just moved to Facebook. And she has this really interesting quote. She says that this is the opportunity to do what I love most: tech infused with a sense of humanity, audacious science delivered at a scale in products that feel almost magic. So here you have the former head of DARPA moving from Google, now going to Facebook, saying that she can't wait to bring this defense military type of structure into Facebook to make magic technology.
Wow.
And
so Facebook will be doing more than data mining in the future then?
Yeah, this was just published, I believe it was this week by, Huffington Post, I believe. So that kind of takes you to where you're saying here. Technology, transhumanist technology that's being perpetrated by DARPA has now moved, moved into something that people use every day. Facebook, a social app. Why would you use military-grade, technology and structure like that into a social app? It's very, very alarming.
Right. And just about everybody that has a computer now, has a Facebook page and, Facebook friends, etc. Our ministry has Facebook. Probably most ministries do have Facebook. So it does really bring it down to life as it, as it exists in modern day America.
Absolutely. And I believe that in the very near future, we're going to see a transformation here. We're just like we saw in the past 30 years, we're going to see in the next 5 years, I believe.
Well, let's discuss that transformation on our program next week, Josh. We are out of time for today. We have been speaking with Joshua Matriciana of Jeremiah Films, more recently Revolution Films, concerning his documentary film entitled Transhumanism, Recreating Humanity. This is a nearly hour-long video that deals with every aspect of the transhumanism issue. We will pick up our discussion of this fascinating subject next week. But for now, Jerry will share how you may obtain a copy of this vital film.
On the next broadcast, Dr. Snitker and Carol continue with Josh Matriciana on the intriguing subject of transhumanism. In the meantime, you'll want to get a copy of the 55-minute DVD. You may get Transhumanism, Recreating Humanity by calling, writing, or emailing Southwest Prophecy Ministries. One copy will be sent for a gift of $25. The mailing address is Box 58043, Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, 73157. Call 1-405-604-5975. The web address is SWPM.us. In days past, the probability of technology that's brought us to this point in history was nothing more than sci-fi or comic book material. But it has brought about an idea that DNA from humans can be merged with animal DNA, producing a transhuman. What should Christians do in the face of this heresy? The DVD, Transhumanism, Recreating Humanity, gives you insights to answer that question. Contact Southwest Prophecy Ministries today for your copy. The contribution is $25. The mailing address is Box 58043, Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, 73157. Call 1-405-604-5975. The web address is swpm.us. We really do need to hear from you if you want programs of this type to continue on this station. Let us know the call letters when you call, write, or email. Plan to be with us next weekend for another Southwest Prophecy's Last Days Beacon program and the exciting interview with Josh Matriciana.